Well, hi and welcome to our last Miércoles de SOMA of the year. Thank you for being here in this amazing presentation by the artist Melissa Ferrari. I'm going to read a brief statement so you get sort of acquainted with her work, and then we'll start, and at the end feel free to come up and interact with this magical the magic lantern. So I'll start. Melissa Ferrari is an experimental animator, non-fiction filmmaker, magic lanternist, and educator who seeks to acquaint folklore of the past with contemporary culture. In exposing peripheral histories, she aims to unveil the wonder that lies in the shadow of non-fiction rather than fiction. Her practice engages with the mythification of science and pseudosciences, the preternatural, and histories of phantasmagoria and documentary. Melissa also creates commissioned animations for documentaries, specializing in handmade animation for films addressing social issues. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Huge thanks to SOMA for having me, and Eduardo Thomas for inviting me to be here. I had a really nice time meeting some of the students and looking at their work last week, so I'm grateful to be here. I'm going to do an artist talk today, just kind of walk through my background in animation and how I came to start working with magic lanterns, and then towards the end I'll do a short magic lantern demonstration / performance. And at the end you're welcome to come up and look at things if you're interested. But to start, so my background is primarily in experimental animation and also using animation for documentary commissions. So I'm just going to start by showing a little bit of my more commercial work, but I consider my commissioned work to be part of my artistic practice, and it's really informed a lot of the things that I'm exploring. So when I was younger, I started out working at an animation studio called Dusty Studio. This was a place that specialized in making handmade animation for commercial documentaries, but we had a big bend on thinking about experimental documentary. And so working there, I had a lot of experience creating animation for longer live action feature documentaries. Here's just a few examples. And most of that work is using either gouache, paint on glass animation techniques on a multiplane, which is where you have layers of glass, or using pastel palimpsest techniques, which is where you're drawing into a piece of paper frame by frame. And so I'll just show a very short clip from one of my recent documentary commissions so you can get an idea of what that looks like. And I apologize, I hope the subtitles are accurate, but I apologize if they're not.
I was talking to a friend the other day about how few salmon I've seen in the watershed this season. They told me, when a species is hanging on by a thread and it's so hard to come by, we're almost forced to imagine them. On the central coast of California, once robust populations of coho salmon and steelhead are now listed as threatened and endangered. Coho are even said to be functionally extinct in coastal watersheds south of the Golden Gate. Here on the unceded lands of the Awaswas-speaking Yupi tribe in present-day Santa Cruz County, salmon have lived alongside wildfire, drought, landslides, and floods for millennia. But as climate change renders disturbances all the more frequent, salmon rely increasingly on human efforts to keep their species afloat. The CZU lightning complex fires of 2020 burned through the Scott Creek watershed, further entangling the fate of these salmon with us So how do the otherwise normal relationships between salmon and fire change for a species seemingly on life support? And how, in the midst of climate crisis, can we create a better home for salmon here on the Central Coast?
So that was a clip from a film called Southern Range, directed by Kyle Baker. It's a documentary about the kind of relationships between salmon and humans in Santa Cruz. So in my work making documentary animation, I became really interested in questions of the truth of an image, and especially when you're thinking about a photographic image versus a hand-drawn image. How can you consider that to be a documentary artifact or object? And so in my kind of thinking about what types of work I wanted to make independently, I became very infatuated with the subject of cryptozoology. For those not familiar, it's a pseudoscience or a science, depending on who you ask, that is the study of creatures that some people believe exist and other people believe don't exist. And you know, Bigfoot, the Yeti, the Loch Ness Monster are some of the most popular cryptids or creatures within cryptozoology. And I was really interested in the kinds of histories of science that you found within cryptozoology, where you had a lot of stories from hundreds or thousands of years ago that we consider to be mythology, but were contemporary science of the day, and vice versa, thinking about science today and how the way it's often talked about and distributed, it really functions as a modern day mythology. And so I started finding a bunch of stories within the history of cryptozoology, which were primarily scientific explanations for things that people had seen. And I started creating a body of work of animation experiments, visualizing the narratives. And I was primarily working outside with pastel, either on paper or on outdoor surfaces. And I was thinking a lot about like the history of educational film and how when you say educational film, you usually kind of cringe. And the idea of educational film is something most people consider boring. But I find myself really drawn to true stories over fiction. And so I was curious about finding forms of filmmaking that were exciting for people while also being educational. And also thinking about if experimental documentary is a field, then what does animated experimental documentary look like? And already like the field of animated documentary is 100 years old, but it's really only recently been accepted in academic scholarship. And still today you find a lot of documentarians who don't really perceive animation as being a valid way of telling a documentary story. So those are just some things I was thinking about. And I'm going to go ahead and show you one of my films that I made about cryptids. And this is a piece called Phototaxis, and this will be the one film that I showed today. And so this is an experimental animated documentary about a particular cryptid called the Mothman. And so I grew up in Virginia, in the United States, right on the border of Virginia and West Virginia. And so the local creature in our folklore was this kind of hybrid man moth called the Mothman. So I'm going to go ahead and play the film and then talk about it a bit. And this film is 7 minutes.
In our recovery, we find it essential to accept reality.
It took a long time, for me to realize what I was dealing with. It's something that the human mind could not understand.
The nature of our belief will determine the manner of our prayers and meditations. We need only make sure that we have a system of belief that works for us.
By working the steps, we come to accept a higher power's will. Acceptance leads to recovery. We lose our fear of the unknown. We are set free.
Seeing something like this, but I've never had such an experience. I was scared.
We just wanted to talk to a preacher, but no one would talk to us. We were isolated from the community.
It's become an obsession.
I have had vivid, strange dreams every night since I saw the fallen angel.
I saw it flying just down the road. It was terrifying in the way anything's terrifying if it shakes your understanding of what's real. But the thing itself wasn't scary. It just kind of sat there on the fence. It had this look of fear, and I felt sorry for it. It didn't seem to belong here.
If I'd seen it only by myself, I wouldn't have said anything about it. But there were 4 of us who saw it. Believe me, if you ever saw it, you'd be a believer.
It's hard to believe what people are saying, but my own son experienced it. I think it's difficult for everyone to understand what's going on when the whole community is afraid.
We don't have to be religious to accept this idea. The point is that we open our minds to believe. We may have difficulty with this, but by keeping an open mind, sooner or later we find the help we need.
As we seek our personal contact with God, we begin to open up as a flower in the sun.
It didn't mean to harm us.
Last night in Mason County, West Virginia, 2 couples told of being chased by a strange creature. The witnesses were riding in a car in the TNT area outside of Point Pleasant. As they crested a hill near the abandoned military igloos, the form of a man...
We begin to see more clearly what is real. Through constant contact with our higher power, the answers that we seek come to us.
Look, I've known these kids all of their lives. They've never
Sheriff
been
Johnson said he would arrest anybody caught with a loaded gun in the TNT
It was like a flying man with 10-foot wings.
They saw it.
It was gray with red eyes that reflected the headlights.
Mrs. Bennett was so paralyzed in fear that she dropped her baby daughter on the ground before scooping her up and running back inside the
I
house.
think individuals, until they've encountered somebody,
They continued to be demonized. That movie driver swore he saw the thing on the bridge right before it collapsed. I'm not saying that will necessarily cause it, but it's got to be connected to some way. Right?
Making a flapping noise and flying at about 100
Cars stalling, the rear patterns on the TV, abnormal sounds at night. People have been seeing strange lights over the river too. It's hard to believe they're not all connected. But what does it all mean?
As we see coincidences and miracles happening in our lives, acceptance becomes trust. We grow to feel comfortable with our higher power as a source of strength. The process of coming to believe restores us to sanity.
So with that film, I was interested in researching the Mothman, that I found a lot of kind of parallels between the types of thinking in Narcotics Anonymous, and a lot of the writing, how it's kind of mythologized, and things like the concept of magical thinking or synchronicity, and just like ways when pseudoscience can kind of bleed into culture, especially when spaces are made open by grief. So that was a film that I made. And so in all of that previous experience I've talked about, working commercially in documentary animation and then also making my own research-based experimental animation, I continue to be really interested in how animated documentary works and specifically how people research for animated documentary. And so, for example, if you're making an animation about a subject and you are consulting with a scientist or an expert on the subject, what does that relationship look like? How you communicate? And I was particularly inspired by the work of Penny Lane and this film called Nuts. Has anyone seen this film? I recommend it. It's a super strange animated feature-length documentary about a guy who said that he could cure impotence by surgically implanting goat testicles into people. So the film, the thing that I found really interesting about the film was this was in the kind of era where everybody was talking about fake news and post-truth filmmaking. And so Penny Lane made a full annotated bibliography that accompanied the documentary. And so you could see exactly what facts were informing all the animation in it, and also you could see how true they were. So for some things she would say, okay, this didn't happen, but it made the story better in the documentary. And I was really inspired by that move to be so forthcoming about the kind of research and process that goes into a documentary film, especially when it's something that's animated. So every single frame is constructed so entirely, and just giving an audience as a window into how you're making the decisions to draw was something I found important. And at the same time, I was also really motivated by the amount of fake documentaries that I was seeing about cryptozoology, and this kind of really fueled my interest to keep working in documentary or in cryptozoology. And so I'll talk a little bit, or you'll hear a bit about this in the performance that I'm going to do today. But there was a lot of fake feature-length documentaries about cryptozoology that started coming out and being released about all kinds of different subjects. And I was really interested in this kind of concern about pseudoscience in the United States and how religion seemed to really be continuing to affect how people interpret scientific fact. So I'll just show a little clip from CNN that covers this phenomenon. It'll play.
You're smart. You know a fake mermaid when you see one, right? Life under the sea is better than anything they got up there. You know that The Little Mermaid is an animation, and that Sharknado and Sharktopus, they're fake. But what about this footage of alleged mermaids that recently aired on Animal Planet? Or this image of a seemingly enormous shark fin on the Discovery Channel? Those were packaged in documentaries on channels known for documentaries, for facts, but they were not.
So it's so silly looking, but the fact that it was CGI animation and there were people who were interpreting the CGI, the computer animation, as photographic material is something that really fascinated me. And it's something that I now understand more with AI, because I have really bad literacy for understanding when images are made with AI. But I was also intrigued that in the coverage of it, like when you heard him talking about animation, he talks about The Little Mermaid and he's like, oh, it's drawn, it's animation. But when he's talking about things like Sharknado, he doesn't say it's animation, he says it's fact. And so just that erasure of animation when it comes to computer animation, which is heavily used in encrypted media, was something I found interesting. So I started exploring really the differences between, drawn images of cryptids, CG images, hoax videos of cryptids, and just kind of aesthetically looking at the filmmaking techniques that people would use. either to create hoax footage or to create scientific visualizations, which I think are even easier to perceive as true because they're not claiming to have photographic indexicality. They're just showing you representations of monsters in a visual language that we interpret as scientific. These are things that I was kind of fascinated by. And at the time that I was researching this, I happened to go to the Society for Animation Studies conference in Padua, Italy. And one of the keynote speakers runs a pre-cinema museum there. Her name is Madame Zadi, and she was a magic lanternist for decades. So now I'm going to kind of switch gears to talk about magic lanterns, but how many of you have seen a magic lantern performance before? Okay, we have a few people. So for those who are not familiar, magic lanterns, there's one right here, are essentially large slide projectors. So if you've ever worked with a 35mm slide projector, it's a very similar technology. There's a series of lenses, a source of illumination, and slides. And historically, some of these slides were mechanized so that you could create animated images. So magic lanterns are the way that people could first watch projected animated moving images centuries before the invention of celluloid film. And so I'm going to talk about two quickly types of magic lantern show that really inspired me to start working with magic lanterns. And one you'll see on the upper right corner is the fact that magic lanterns were often used to illustrate scientific lectures, and they're considered very important in the history of popular science education because where they were invented in Europe at the time, there were a lot of scientists who were interested in making free, accessible science shows. And the idea of science as a spectacle or a form of entertainment was really a big thing at the time. And so magic lanterns, because they're kind of like PowerPoint of the 19th century, were great for science lectures. But the type of show that Madame Zadi talked about that really drew me into magic lanterns is something called the phantasmagoria. And I'll just quickly describe that history so you can understand why I'm using this technology. And the phantasmagoria was invented in the 18th century. And I should mention that magic lanterns were invented in the 17th century in Europe, but they very quickly spread around the world. They were first invented by, scholars kind of disagree about who really truly invented the first magic lantern, but one of the first inventors was Christian Huygens, who was a really important scientist. He did some scholarship on aliens even in the 18th century and space and a lot of different physics experiments. And so he invented this optical machine, really trying to learn about the physics of perception. But then people really quickly realized how great it is to use for entertainment in like frivolous shows. So he actually went on record and said he was very embarrassed to have invented the magic lantern because he thought it was too silly of a technology for a serious scientist to invent. But another person who was maybe even earlier, at least thinking about magic lanterns or the possibility of inventing them, was a Jesuit monk named Athanasius Kirchner. And so he and other early religious figures who were experimenting with magic lanterns liked that they could project scary images, possibly to instill the fear of hell into their congregations. So you can imagine if you saw giant flying demons, you might be afraid of hell. And so very early on, the first animated lantern slide that was designed for the magic lantern was a skeleton taking its head off. And I'll also mention that the magic lantern quickly spread throughout the world, including into Mexico. And when I was coming here, I did a little bit of research into the magic lantern in Mexico, and I found that Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, the poet here, she actually was corresponding with Athanasius Kirchner, and she, in one of her famous poems, wrote about the potential of the magic lantern to make us think about perception in the brain. And she was kind of predicting that it would be used for ghosts and apparitions, which I thought was kind of cool. But I want to quickly say that the phantasmagoria also really heavily spread to Japan, and it has its own really unique, amazing magic lantern tradition where they use handheld projectors with slides, and they are able to make creatures fly around the room. But the type of phantasmagoria that brought me into magic lanterns was the early European shows. And so this was at the late 1700s. There were a few people who were either scientists or artists, some of whom belonged to Masonic societies, so they were interested in like magic rituals. And they realized that these projectors could be used to create horror shows. And so they made this form of immersive horror theater where they would have hidden magic lanterns that were rear projecting creatures and ghosts and witches and different supernatural things before an audience. And just a few, I won't fully dive into the history, it's really fascinating, so I recommend Mervyn Hurd's book on phantasmagoria if you want to learn more. But a few things that I liked were the fact that science was really present, even though it was a supernatural show. So they would bring the audiences into a room and do a bunch of science experiments for them before the Magic Lantern show as a way of trying to get people to think about what's rational and what's irrational, and like what's the line between what is magic and what is science. And here's an example of the type of magic lantern that they would use in the phantasmagoria. So in these shows, they used something called a phantoscope, which was a magic lantern on wheels, so that they could push the magic lantern towards and away from the screen, and that way the projected images could actually fly at the audience. So if you've ever heard the story about early cinema audiences seeing a train rushing at them and jumping out of the way, that I think did not happen. I think that's a myth. But it did happen in the Magic Lantern Phantasmagoria, where this technology that could allow things to rush at the screen was this really effective, scary new way of perceiving images. But the thing that I was really drawn to is that in these spaces, they would fill the room with smoke, and so the projections would be kind of like physical apparitions in the room. And there was a history of seance involved. So a lot of the early Phantasmagoria lanternists, they would sometimes find out who recently died in the town they were performing in, and then they would paint magic lantern slides in the likeness of those people who had died, so that suddenly you were attending the show and then your neighbor who recently passed away was manifesting in the room with you. Or a little later on, you could actually pay certain Phantasmagoria artists so that you could communicate with a dead loved one, and you would meet with them a few days before the show, pay them a little bit of extra money, tell them what they looked like, and then they would have their slide artist paint a slide in the likeness of your dead wife, for example, and you would be given the opportunity to talk with them. And so I was really attracted to the fact that there was really mixed reactions from the audiences who attended these shows, where on one hand there's many accounts of skeptics going to the Phantasmagoria show and trying to debunk them and saying, oh, I know there's some technology that's creating these apparitions in the room with us. I know they're not real ghosts, and there's many accounts of the audiences actually ripping down the screen to find the hidden technologies. But then there were also people who attended and truly believed that they were seeing real creatures or real ghosts in the room with them. And because of that, there were also like cases of the lanternists, like Robertson, who was one of the first famous lanternists. He was a physicist by trade, and so when he did his Phantasmagoria shows, he would often debunk them at the beginning of the show. So he would say, oh, everything you're going to see here tonight is fake, it's made with new technologies, but we're here just to think about the philosophy of death and why it's important to embrace life, and that's what we're doing here. And that was partially because they wanted to consider themselves true scientists, and they were thinking about Magic Lantern shows as physics experiments, and they didn't want it to get too silly. But even in those shows where you had people debunking their performances and saying they were fake, you have accounts, and we have like journalistic reports from the time that showed that audiences would still think they were seeing real, true ghost shows, even though the artists were saying that they were fake. And that was partially because they were performing in areas where it was sometimes like illegal to indulge in the supernatural. It was illegal to hold seances, and part of that it's on record that some of the lanternists, like Robertson, threatened to bring back politicians from the dead, like King Louis, who had been executed. And so that is partially why the phantasmagoria shows were sometimes illegal. And so these audiences who would go to the shows and they would hear, okay, this is going to be a fake show, they would then think, well, if they say that it's real, then they can get arrested and thrown in jail for holding a ghost show or for witchcraft. And so they have to say it's fake in order to legally do it, but it's actually real. And so that idea to me of, being told that something's fake, but still just doing everything that you can to believe in it because you want to believe, that was very resonant to me with the cryptozoology documentaries that I was looking at, and just thinking about how people project their beliefs onto animated monsters, essentially. Here's a few examples of some antique phantasmagoria slides. So I decided to start maybe experimenting with magic lanterns, and by coincidence, a week after I went to that conference, I was at a flea market and there was a magic lantern for sale. So I was like, okay, I'm going to try experimenting and see what this technology can do. And so I started making my own handmade magic lantern slides, but the mechanisms are all based on the historic designs. So I laser cut wood to in the same shape of the historic frames, and then I put my own drawings in them. And so a lot of my process is looking at examples of antique animated magic lantern slides and then adapting them to, in this case, cryptozoological subjects. Just a few examples of my process. Skip this because you'll see some of them. And so when I started working with the magic lantern, it seemed like it'd be really simple because it's just a slide projector. But I found that was not the case. It was a kind of a hard art form to learn. And so I started out doing traditional phantasmagoria reenactments, where I was using some of the traditional subject matter that you found in the historical phantasmagorias. So for example, the spiritualists and their attempts to contact the dead. This was a religion in the early 20th century in the US, where mediumship was really important. So I started kind of learning to perform with this subject matter. I didn't have a background in performance at all, and I was kind of upset that I had to learn how to perform. But eventually I made a magic lantern performance that some of you may have seen last night called Relic de Phantasmagoria, which is kind of my modern adaptation of the Phantasmagoria, thinking about cryptozoology and pseudoscience and this lineage of fake animated documentaries. So I'm going to show you a really quick little trailer for it, and then we'll move over to the magic lantern performance.
Over the past 100 years, thousands of intriguing human interest items have appeared in newspapers all over the world, describing incredible encounters with awesome creatures unknown to science. Can all these items be hoaxes and journalistic jokes? Can we believe that the major wire services whose very existence depends on their reliability employ men to concoct and circulate irresponsible tales about hairy giants?
Oh, coyotes. Ooh. Coyotes are really going off. Yeah, I hear them.
We're going to be talking about unicorns, dragons, leviathans, stuff like that. And we'll kind of just discuss them as far as like what we believe they are, because there's animals, we know that they're real animals because they're in the Bible.
Look at it. Keeps staring at us. It was way too big to be a deer, so I was just waiting to see the thing move, to get some movement, so I could identify what it was.
The rise of pseudoscience in the 21st century is a very worrying development. You know, if someone believes in Bigfoot, and you try to say, well, you know, from an evolutionary biology standpoint, these things can't exist. And yeah, but I still believe them anyway, I believe in science, okay, that's not a big deal. But with things like climate denial and the anti-vaccination movement, and now the government officials are saying.
Okay, so I switch over to do a lantern show for you right now. And so I will be showing, I'll start with like 5 minutes of traditional phantasmagoria slides. And so these are antique 19th century slides that I've collected over time with a few of my own handmade phantasmagoria slides. And the sound that you'll hear for that is a collage of glass harmonica music, which is the instrument that was primarily used in phantasmagoria shows. There's some sound recordings from early 20th century seances in the US. And then there's also music from a Hawaiian metal band that I often collaborate with called Shrine Maiden. And then there'll be about 10 minutes of a couple of excerpts from Relict. And Relict is usually a 2-channel piece, so I'm doing a single channel version just to show you some slides and let you hear some of the sound design from it. But you'll hear pieces from an interview that I did with the historian of science called Dr. Regal, and then some other pieces from the show. So just give me a minute to switch gears from digital to analog, and then I'll go on.
voice examples have been circulated privately, but has not been popular with researchers because they've been unable to pin it down to any terrestrial source, and it hasn't been too popular with spiritualists because of the evident distress of the communicator and the firmness and even sternness of her teachers. Two rather strange voices led into a curious episode. 3 or 4 determined and very clearly spoken female entities drill or persuade a rather shaky and frightened individual called Amy or Ilmi to give what she eventually calls some evidence in a shaky voice.
that someone within 200 miles of your home has had a direct confrontation with a frightening apparition or inexplicable monster within the last generation.
Cryptozoology is the study and search for creatures, and especially legendary creatures, whose existence has not been scientifically proven. It consists of folklores, legends, and myths that are contextualized as nonfiction. According to the father of cryptozoology, Bernard Uvelman, in order for a creature to be considered a cryptid, it must have at least one quality that makes it emotionally resonant, and thus capable of mythification. Many cryptids are based on spirits or entities appropriated from indigenous stories, which are decontextualized and imposed by cryptozoologists into the framework of Western science.
The most convincing visual evidence of Bigfoot is a film taken by Roger Patterson in Northern California.
Patterson's horse reared, throwing. Patterson grabbed his camera and filmed as he ran. Here is his actual footage, the images he captured. What he called the abominable snowman of America, or Bigfoot. If this film is legitimate, then there can no longer be any question about Bigfoot.
The cryptozoological researchers say, there we are, here is historical evidence. And the problem with that is you cannot take that stuff at face value. You know, we have this view that somehow fake news is a 21st century invention. If you know anything about the history of journalism in America, there was a tradition of editors just making stuff up. And if you don't understand the history, then when you see an article about somebody finding a Bigfoot skeleton in Minnesota someplace, it sounds legitimate.
We know that our little planet is infested with remarkable animals and insects that defy common sense. Have you ever considered the total absurdity of the giraffe? Or that inane rodent, the lemming, swarms of which periodically march across miles of ice in the Arctic to drown themselves in the sea?
Disney's Academy Award-winning White Wilderness, a 1958 feature that explored wildlife in the high Arctic, famously featured a scene of lemmings so driven with migratory frenzy that they hurled themselves off a cliff into the freezing sea. Far from documenting natural behavior, the scene was staged and filmmakers chased the animals off of a cliff.
They reached the final precipice. This is the last chance to turn back. Yet over they go, casting themselves bodily out into space.
In 2012, the Discovery Channel premiered a new documentary, Mermaids, The Body Found, and the following year its sequel, Mermaids, The New Evidence. These films combine CGI reenactment and conventional documentary elements, claiming that evidence and research into the existence of mermaids has been covered up by the government. A representative from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, as well as other scientific experts, are featured on the show in support of the existence of mermaids. However, all of the figures seen in the documentary are hired actors, and the film was distributed as a documentary despite being entirely fabricated. Mermaids was widely criticized in the media, and government agencies, including NOAA, had to release statements denying their involvement with the film and denying the existence of mermaids. As Andrew David Thaler describes in his article, The Politics of Fake Documentaries, the bold and outright fabrications of shows like Mermaids erodes the public's trust in government and scientific organizations. NOAA, the organization in the film, is the primary government agency in the United States responsible for educating the public about climate change. Despite criticism, Mermaids garnered the highest ratings in annual Planet history, so the Discovery Channel continued generating more fake documentaries on cryptozoology. happy to answer any questions if anyone has any. Otherwise, you're welcome to come up and there's a few slides I didn't get to, and particularly some astronomy slides that I would love to show anybody interested. But does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
Is there any further books about magic lanterns and Victoria that you've heard?
Yes. So there is a great book called The Art of Light and Shadow by Warren Manoni. And then I have been admiring the work of Michael Herrero, based in Spain, but his writing is published in Spanish, and so I haven't been able to read it, but you all can. And he's doing really interesting research into things like the use of magic lanterns to create what are considered biblical miracles. So like, you know, in the early magic lantern history, some of the contemporary biblical miracles were probably produced with magic lanterns, and some interesting phantasmagoria research too. There's also 2 magic lantern societies that have a lot of publications, and the U.S. Society has an archive that's freely available with a lot of research. So it's on the Internet Archive. Oh yeah, there's also a few posters from the show that we did yesterday, if anyone wants one. And then I also have 3 postcards over there that my uncle painted. He's a sideshow painter, so he made me my own carnival poster. Thank you so much, and welcome to